Let's pray. O God, from whom every family in heaven and on earth takes its name, teach us as we read and reflect together to wrestle as those who are confident you will bless us with new understanding and renewed commitment. May we grow in devotion and dedication to you, and may that increased love enlarge our love for all with whom we are in relationship. In the name of him who called you Father, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Let me read to you the main text that we're looking at today. It's from the Gospel of Luke, and it's chapter 14, verses 25 to 33. Now, large crowds were traveling with Jesus, and he turned and said to them, "Whoever comes to me and does not hate father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself, cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you, intending to build a tower, does not first sit down and estimate the cost to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it will begin to ridicule him, saying, 'This fellow began to build and was not able to finish.' Or what king going out to wage war against another king will not sit down first and consider whether he is able with 10,000 to oppose the one who comes against him with 20,000? If he cannot, then while the other is still far away, he sends a delegation and asks for the terms of peace. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions." Okay. Somebody that's got one of those fancy electronic versions of the Bible or Hoyt brought his, I like that. But we got Bibles too. Somebody read Matthew 10, verses 37 and 38. Matthew 10, 37 and 38.
Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me.
Okay. Notice the difference in that, Luke. What's the difference? What does he say?
More
More than me.
than me.
And she finds Matthew's version more palatable, but also not without problems. Do you agree with that? Yeah, still problematic. Right, yeah. So how might the quality of our relationships with our family affect the way we hear and respond to Jesus's words? Read that again. How might the quality of our relationships with our family affect the way we hear and respond to Jesus's words?
I sort of agree with her, is that the closer bond you have in your family, the closer your family is together, then the more difficult the words are.
Yeah. And
If
so,
you're in a dysfunctional family, it might not be so as difficult.
That's true.
yeah. That's good. She says we can no more obey a command to hate a loved one than we can obey a command to love someone for whom that spark is just not there. Just hate is like love. It is something felt in the heart, not determined by intellect. If, as AJ suggests, it is impossible to obey a command to hate, well, then why does Jesus make such a demand? Is Jesus's command to hate different from his commands to love? Remember John 13, 34 to 35? What does Jesus basically say there? They'll know us how?
By our
By
love.
our
for each
love.
other.
Yeah, our love for one another, right? Since love can also be something felt in the heart. Is this command to hate different than the command to love? I would say yes. To some extent. We're not there yet, but don't you think so? I mean, it almost has to be, right?
I would think so.
And I have seen many a pastor who, if you asked him, and it would be a him, because it's not done so much now, but in another generation. If you asked him if he loved his family, oh yeah. But the church and his commitment to Jesus makes it very clear. Probably not loving them the way you should. And I blame the church for a lot of that. The expectation of the church. Yeah.
I want you to, Pastor, tell me, we were talking about a business deal,
Mhm.
and I asked him, well, what do you think Frida will think about this? Frida was his wife.
Yeah.
And he says, I'm married to the church.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter what she thinks.
Yeah.
We
Yeah.
did not do a deal.
I think a lot of that same feeling has to do with why so many pastors put on airs about their family life.
Sure.
And in public, they act one way, but when you really get to know them, it's something entirely different.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes. I'm gonna move on down here a little bit. The sheet, the study guide, we need about 3 hours to do all of this, so I'm picking through these, but. Regarding Jesus's demand that disciples hate life itself, that's what he said. Hate life itself in the Greek, AJ notes. Their own psyche, meaning sense of self or even own soul is the way to kind of read that. AJ says the point is not that we should hate life and therefore rather be dead. The point is that we turn to Jesus and in so doing, turn away from the earlier markers of our identity. So what markers of our identity or your identity, if any, do we place less emphasis on or turn away from entirely because of our faith? Are there any markers of our identity, any you'd like to share? Any markers of our identity that we place less emphasis on or turn away from entirely because of our faith? Yeah.
I was reading something that goes along with this morning in the devotion.
Yeah.
The writer of the devotion went to China and was visiting with the leaders of some of the home churches.
Yes.
And he met this guy there who said was 44 years old. He said he was brought up in the Communist Party all of his life.
Sure.
As a teenager, he was head of the Youth Communist Party. And said every day on the way to work, he passed by this house that was a home church.
Yeah.
And he went in one day to see what was going on. And he was interested. He got a Bible, read it through, and he became a Christian. He went to his office and he told his boss or whoever it was in the Communist Party that he had become a Christian. And the guy got very upset and basically kicked him out of there.
Yeah.
He went home and his dad, his boss had called his dad and told him what was going on. His dad got so mad, kicked him out of the house, threw all his clothes out the street. And he said only survived by, friends helping him. And at this particular time of the writing, he said the guy was in over 266,000 Christians in his area, and that he only got to see his wife one time a year. From the outside looking in, I would say it would appear that he hated
Yeah.
hated himself and life and everything else, but he probably because of his faith and what he was doing, was probably one of the happiest people around.
Well, thank you for sharing that. That's good. Yeah. I used to catch a lot of grief from more conservative Christians. Conservative is not a good word. More fundamentalist Christians who thought that when I became a Christian, I needed to forsake the secular music that I listened to. And my words to them were, hey, as soon as you can point me to Christians who are making music that's anywhere on par with this stuff here, and I found a couple. Okay. I might think about forsaking, but there are some music artists that it's better for me not to listen to from a lyrical standpoint. And so you have to be careful with that. and television as well. Yeah, we have to be very careful to, with movies and stuff like that. So, but I agree that we need to be careful with what we put in. I mean, Jesus has a lot to say about that. Because it affects what comes out, what we put in. So I have to be, myself, have to be very careful about that. All right, one more question here, and then we'll, no, maybe not, maybe two. How do you imagine the crowds living in a land occupied by the Roman Empire, whose army put criminals to death by crucifixion, responded when Jesus told them his disciples must carry the cross? How do you think they responded to that?
Probably quite a few walked away.
Imagine so. I mean, I've got the Jerusalem cross on, with 4 little bitty Jerusalem crosses in the middle. Some of you ladies in here wear a cross from time to time. Some of you guys do. It's it's an ornament that hangs around our necks with pride, and it's, to us, it's beautiful, but to them, it's an everyday sight.
It was a horror.
Well, to them before, well, even after the crucifixion,
Right.
for a while, it meant something totally different than what it means to us.
Oh, yes. Carry the cross, right? So on the back of that, how do you hear people talk about their cross to bear? You ever heard that? This is my cross to bear.
Whole lot easier than the real cross.
For us, anyway.
But how do you hear people talk about that? How do you talk about it? What, I'll even personalize it. What do you consider your crosses? What is your cross? Have you even really thought about it? And I know what Carol's is.
But that's for her to say.
That's right, that's right, that's right.
And I would never say that because it's not true.
Anyway, what about, yeah,
I've heard people make that, and it's generally been something physical
sure.
that they've had to deal with, for a long period of time. It may be, say some family member has brought, shame on the family or whatever, they view it as their cross to bear because of what the family member did or whatever. Yeah, I've heard say that.
Okay.
I've lost friends,
Yeah,
or people I thought were friends.
right. Yes, ma'am. Let me go on with this question. We talk about our cross to bear, but AJ says Jesus means, bearing the cross means taking action when we are aware of suffering, even if that action causes us more suffering. So she says it is. It says we take action when we see or are aware of suffering, even though that may cause us more suffering. So the question would be in view of that definition, when has your awareness or when has, of someone else's suffering provoked you to take action, even though, with the caveat, it may increase your suffering? Can any of you share a time that maybe that happened? That you put yourself in harm's way? Suffering for someone else?
I think a lot of people who work with the homeless, especially stay in some of those shelters and stuff, they're putting themselves in harm's way.
Certainly.
It's, they're basically putting their faith in God who's going to protect them.
Yeah.
I worked in one or two that was interesting, to say the least.
This question is difficult. This whole concept of carrying the cross, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote eloquently on this. This whole discussion of carrying the cross in our Western culture is really hard for us to talk about, because for the most part, I won't say all the time and everyone, because it would be incorrect, but for the most part, we have managed to create a world in which carrying the cross truly is optional. And I'm not saying that to denigrate it, I'm just saying it's kind of fact. In a lot of not for everyone, but in a lot of circumstances. So it just doesn't hit us like it would have those who are actually suffering for their faith or seeing others suffering and throwing themselves in front of. We hear about it though. We think about stories like the Good Samaritan. That's one element of that story. The Samaritan throws himself into possible harm himself in caring for the man in the ditch.
I
So-
think a lot of, to kind of personalize it, I think that Jan and John dealing with Keith is a good example of
Okay,
that.
okay, okay. I would agree.
Yeah, what I was gonna say.
That
Okay.
helps me a lot.
I'll think of it in a minute.
Okay, bud. Mr. Hoyt?
Yeah, we live in a very different world
We do.
than, in the time of Jesus here. And as hard as some church people want to admit it, we live in a world as a whole that has less hunger, less poverty, less harm by the empire and all that sort of stuff. I've seen it in my lifetime. I can remember when there was no help from the government. The only help you could get from the government was if a man died, then his widow would draw support for 1 year
Sure.
from the government. 1 year. If she died, he got nothing. But then we began to create organizations like, the Salvation Army, the Red Cross, and where there was a lot. And then on the secular side, the government side, the beginnings of Social Security, and then I can remember when Medicare went in, and before Medicare went in, older people were just crap out of luck
Yeah, that's
if
right.
they got sick.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
They
true.
didn't have any insurance.
True.
No intelligent insurance company would insure them
Of course not.
because they were going to be, they would spend
You'll be
more than
drawing
the
on
premiums
it,
would
yeah,
ever
right.
come in.
Right.
And I remember when that came in, and that it was the way people felt, you could just feel it in the older community, that now it was going to be different, and it was different. But when it came in, there was no supplemental.
Right, right.
It was only the pure Medicare, which would only pay 80% of what they established to be. Now, the provider, if they wanted to charge you 300 and the Medicare says, no, it's 150 and we'll pay 80% of 150, then you had to pay 20% of the 150.
Right.
And that in some ways it was not a perfect solution, but it
Right.
was a much better solution than before.
Yeah. Okay, yeah, go
I
ahead.
remember what I was gonna say now.
Go ahead, buddy.
In Jesus' day, the people who followed him, I think the biggest thing they had to worry about was the leaders of the church.
Hmm.
Because to be kicked out of the church, was, I guess, the same as death. In
Yeah.
some respect.
Yeah, to be expelled
then-
from the synagogue, yeah.
And
He
then
became
later
unclean.
years after Jesus died, then it became the Roman Empire, because if you profess to be a Christian, you could be arrested, beaten, fed to the animal,
Oh, yes.
or crucified on the cross, just like he was.
Certainly.
But I think in Jesus' day, they were more scared of the leaders of the church than they were anybody else.
Yeah, the Jews who were attracted to Christ and were considering, and the Gospel of John speaks to this, more actually than, the synoptic gospels do, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Yes, they were very fearful of losing that identity marker, being in the synagogue, because you lost, not only would you lose synagogue membership, but, your family would turn on you. And yeah, it would be a total outcasting of you. Yeah. So it was a big deal it was really big deal to confess Christ. You know, here at New Hope, and I'm just gonna throw this on the fire and then we're gonna move on. We're gonna watch the video. Here at New Hope, we gotta have people immersed so they can vote in the annual congregational meeting.
It's true.
I gotta be honest with you. I don't think that's the reason to be baptized.
No.
I mean, I'm just me personally, but we have, we all have to do what we have to do, so, anyway, just thought I'd throw that out there. Yeah, board chair, can you take care of that? There you go. But let's hear what AJ has to say about, hating father and mother. We're gonna watch her little video. It's about 13 minutes. Here we go. Here we go. There we are. By the way, I watched a video of her online. She doesn't teach in her shoes. She takes them off. She doesn't like to teach in shoes.
I understand. If it's summertime, but not winter.
It's difficult enough to be told, sell all you have and give to the poor. It's hard enough to be told, be generous or be more generous than you are. But then we get to Jesus here in the Gospel of Luke saying, in order to be my disciple, you have to hate your father, your mother, your wife. We're presuming male disciples here, your children, in order to follow me. Jesus, hate my parents, I can't. Hate my children, impossible. Hate my dog, I can't even do that. What were you thinking? So we wrestle again. The Gospel of Luke tells us that Jesus has been teaching the crowds, and the crowds have been following him. Well, of course they follow him. He gives free medical care. He tells them good news. He's inspirational. His very presence gives them hope. And then he zaps them. Suddenly, to the crowds who are following him, he says in the Gospel of Luke, unless you hate your mother and your father, your wife, your children, you cannot be my disciple. And then he adds on, take up your cross daily and follow me. And the crowds would have been shocked. This isn't free medical care. This isn't, oh, I'm comfortable in my own setting. This is a challenge, a severe challenge. How can you possibly hate your parents or your spouse or your children or your puppy? But that's in part what it means to take up the cross. What's of ultimate import? How do you define yourself not as a child or a spouse or a parent? How do you define yourself as a disciple? And what's the cost? In speaking to our rich young ruler, Jesus says, you know the commandments, including honor your father and mother. In the Jewish tradition, numbered the 5th commandment. But then we get, you have to hate your father and mother along with your spouse and your children. How do you put this together? And there are various ways that we might consider. For example, one way we have, I believe, of honoring our parents is by choosing our own path and eventually becoming independent adults, rather than holding on to daddy or holding on to mommy and doing only what they want, rather than determining who we should be. Does that look like we're hating our parents? Well, perhaps to the outside it does. But one great way of honoring parents is to figure out who you are yourself. Another way within the Jesus tradition, you have new parents, because Jesus says, who are my mother and brothers and sisters? Who is my true father, the one in heaven? So what does it mean to become a disciple? It means picking up a new family and, in fact, new parents. I am an only child, and my mother was 44 when I was born. I was a very, very happy surprise because she never thought she'd ever be able to have children. I was extremely close to both of my parents. My father died when I was quite young, but I still keep a picture of him on my desk. The very idea that we are told to hate our parents, viscerally, this bothers me. because I so loved my parents and I was so attached to them. This may be what Jesus is speaking about here. What is most important to you? Whom do you love the most? And the call that he gives is there might be something even more than that. Perhaps you have to take up your cross. Perhaps you have to give up your own life. How important is discipleship? If you know how important love of your parents is, discipleship is the next step, and it's hard. According to Luke, Jesus tells the crowds, not just his own disciples, but people who are following him, hate your parents, hate your spouse. In Matthew's version, it's tamed down or domesticated, made more homey, made easier, just love me more. You know, when you think about that, that's also a problem. What do you mean love you more than love?
Progress.
Love you more than I love my children. But that's the call of discipleship. And ideally, the disciple loving Jesus more, loving God more, might actually find a greater love for parents, a greater love for children, because now that love is infused with a greater love of the community and the call to discipleship that Jesus offers. When I struggle with a text, when its meaning eludes me, or when my own sense is, I don't want to do this, that's too hard. One thing that I do is I look at the words that are used. People back then didn't have computers, they didn't have typewriters. Some poor person had to write all this stuff down. So every word matters. When Jesus speaks about hating parents or hating one's spouse, I want to know how hate shows up elsewhere in the text. And sometimes I get a clue to what Jesus might have in mind. When I look at the story of Jacob and Esau, back in Genesis, I'm told that Esau hated Jacob, and he had great reason for doing it. Jacob stole his birthright, tricked him out of his blessing. But 20 years later, Jacob, after wrestling with something, his conscience of God, a demon at the river Jabbok, comes out in the morning limping, and he's told, you will now be called Israel because you wrestle with God and with humanity. When he then meets Esau, not only has Jacob changed, so has Esau. And Esau greets him, and the two men kiss. Hatred can be turned to love, and that might be even more powerful love because it overcomes the difficulty. According to the prophet Malachi, Esau was hated, but Jacob was loved. And Paul, in his epistle to the Romans, chapter 8, picks up that verse to talk about God's freedom. God can love Jacob and hate Esau, but you know what? God didn't hate Esau. Esau's also one of the children of God. Hate can be turned into love. It requires work by both parties. Hating parents can actually eventually be a sign of love. When you come into your own, when you take up that cross, when you risk your life for what is right, the love comes flowing in. I was happily teaching at Swarthmore College, a wonderful liberal arts school outside of Philadelphia. However, my husband was teaching at Wesleyan University in Connecticut. So I only got to see him 3 days out of every 7, and I was home with 2 kids. And Vanderbilt University came after me and said, do you want a job? And by the way, we're going to hire your husband too. And I thought, great, I finally get to live in the same household with my husband. My kids will see their dad. So we moved to Tennessee. And within about 2 days, hate mail started to come in. People were saying, how could you possibly hire this Jew to teach New Testament? And people within the Jewish community were saying, oh, she must be a Messianic Jew. She must be a Jesus worshiper. And they were uncomfortable with that. So I was getting hate mail and the dean was getting hate mail. It was awful. And the dean at the time, his name was Joe Hub, fabulous man, invited all these naysayers, all these haters to come to Vanderbilt. And he said to me, talk with them for about 20 minutes. And I explained that I'm not out to undermine Christian teaching. To the contrary, What I want my students to see is how Jesus makes sense in a first century Jewish context and how Paul makes sense in that context. And to help them understand that they do not need to make Judaism look bad in order to make Jesus and Paul look good. And at the same time, I can show them what Jewish history is and explain to Jews, here's a part of our own history that we don't learn in the synagogue. The hatred turned to interest, which turned to welcome, which turned to hospitality, which in many cases actually turned to love. Hatred can be conquered. And one way we do that is by asking questions, by getting to know the people we think we hate, by making sure that we're not just listening through our own echo chambers or our own Facebook friends. But we take that next step. This is what I think Jesus means when he says, love your enemy. That means you have to know your enemy, speak with your enemy, recognize the humanity there. Ask questions. Don't operate in ignorance and don't judge. Jesus says don't judge because you might not have all the facts. Your enemy may in fact turn out to be your best friend. Sometimes theologians will talk about our ultimate concern, or for Jesus, our pearl of great price. What is the most important thing to us? And sometimes that most important thing is the one thing we need to let go or we need to divest. Jesus says you can't serve God and mammon, as if mammon is some sort of God. It's Aramaic and it kind of has the connotation of stuff. You got to let it go. And in the same way, in order to be a disciple, in order to put God front and center, then your family cannot be, and your children cannot be. You love them, you care for them, of course. But at the end of the day, the question you ask is not just, have I been a good parent? Have I been a good spouse? Have I been a good child? But you also ask, have I been a good disciple? Have I recognized what is my ultimate concern? Have I followed God the way I should? The expression, take up your cross, has become tamed as if, oh, I have to bear my cross, I have to pick up the dry cleaning. Or I have to bear my cross, I have to take the dog out early in the morning. To take up your cross in a first century context means do something that would risk not just your reputation, it would risk your life. And if you find something for which your life is worth risking, that's taking up the cross. This is hard. It's abundantly hard. Join the Peace Corps, but you might get killed. Join the military to protect and serve, but you might get killed. Go out on a picket line and you might get killed. Make sure your cause is worthy. Make sure your cause is one of peace rather than of violence. Make sure your cause is for the love of all people rather than for the love of one particular party. Risk your life.
No, if she wasn't Jewish, I would take what she just said seriously. Wow. All right. Do this right here. There we go. Okay. Getting some discussing to do. All right. There's a lot there, you know. Start here. How specifically has discipleship proved hard for you? Passage.
I have a family that tolerates my decision.
So,
Yes, it is.
She says one way we can honor our parents is by choosing our own path in life and becoming independent adults. Does that look like we're hating our parents, she asks? Perhaps to the outside, it does. To what extent did or has your self-determination as an adult? And I think, Jan, you just spoke to this. Has your self-determination as an adult caused friction with those who raised you? It's kind of a strange room to be asking this question in, but did it ever cause friction?
Crystal.
Go ahead, Crystal.
Yes, I remember when I first realized in my heart that God was my father, and I was explaining that to my father, and he got so upset that I went into such a long discussion of how I was so blessed that God, the Father, gave me him as my physical father here. But it cut him to the heart. This was a man who always prayed. And in later times, he was raised Catholic, but in later times, he felt God had left him. And he told me that, how could he, I feel so alone that he's not with me. And I tried to explain, my mother understood more, but my father was a little, who have been raised that way. But when I said my father in heaven, it kind of broke his heart. In this long discussion, I don't even think I penetrated,
No. Wow. Thank you for sharing that. That's right on target.
Yes, it is.
That's right down the line that AJ is talking about. Yeah, wow. Wow. Yeah. AJ talks about the initial hate she encountered when she started teaching at Vanderbilt,
Mhm.
which, by the way, is one of the most liberal of seminary schools, period, but their seminary, their divinity school is one of the most liberal in the nation. I was kind of surprised by some of the hate she got, but
You got to remember now, it's located in the South.
well, that's right, liberal and in the buckle of the Bible Belt, right? The buckle of the Baptist Bible Belt in Nashville. That's true. So she talks about all the hate. But when have you seen people in your community subjected to hate because they are somehow different from the majority?
Well, I think the easiest one for us here is the Muslims.
Yeah.
Particularly since 9/11,
Yes, sir.
that the average person, Muslims are out to kill us. There's going to be a
Right.
Armageddon war of some kind between the Christians and the Muslims and
Sure.
all that sort of stuff. The Muslims have replaced the Jews
Yeah.
by and large particularly in the South,
Right.
and as the group that is the other.
Right.
When I grew up, it was the Jews.
Yeah.
And it was strange because you couldn't buy clothes unless you went to a Jewish store, because almost no matter how small a town you go to, go and look at these deserted towns and look at the stores, and the name over there, they're not in business anymore, but that name up there is Jewish.
Yeah.
Saul's in Lawrenceville, and just all over the place.
Yeah.
It was that way, but that's changed now. Now it's the Muslims.
Sure. That's right. Now, she notes that the mention of wives in verse 26 gives the impression that only men may be disciples. But she also notes that Luke knew of female disciples, and he did. In the Acts of the Apostles, his second book, he calls Tabitha. I like Tabitha's other name because I have an aunt named Dorcas. Poor girl. Yeah. And yes, it came
I
from
used
the
to think of
Bible.
a shark.
I know, right? My grandfather on my mother's side was an Assembly of God preacher. And the Bible names, he named one of his daughters Priscilla, and one of them Dorcas, so. But he calls Tabitha a disciple. Disciples, AJ argues, are known by their good works. Do you agree? Disciples are known by their good works.
Should be.
One of
But-
them. That's
Go
what
ahead,
it
Crystal,
is.
go ahead, dear.
But more than that, it's loyalty and faith that's on that same page,
Yes, ma'am.
you know, not just good works, but the
Absolutely.
loyalty and faith.
I agree. Yeah, that's good. How easily would others identify you? Or me? How easily would others identify us as a disciple of Jesus based on the evidence of our good works? Well, he wears a cross around his neck.
Goes to church on Sunday.
Goes to church on Sunday.
And Wednesday
Yeah,
and
yeah.
Thursday.
Yeah, every time doors are open. Even he's a minister. Well, that's great, but
Mm,
I think in our society, you're judged more on your lack of bad works rather than your possession of good works.
yeah,
As long as you're not doing bad
as long
things,
as you're
you're okay.
you're fine. Yeah.
And nobody's going out here doing all the good things
No.
unless it's Jimmy Carter.
He is, yeah, doing that.
He can always serve as a bad example.
Yeah, right. If you find something for which your life is worth risking, says AJ, she says that's taking up the cross.
mm,
For what, for whom have you or would you be willing to risk your life?
For our children and our spouses,
Yeah,
our grandchildren.
I was once told if your children were on the other side of the canyon or something and you had to go across a beam of 10 foot or they would die. Normally you wouldn't even attempt it, but for your kids or your family, your husband, you might try to make that cross that on that timber, but otherwise, you know, what is worth going across that beam, whatever. Same thing that Hoyt said, your family, your kids, your husband, your wife.
I would stand in front of anybody who wanted to harm any of you,
Mm-hmm.
this church. I would do it.
Well,
And
church family.
I would stand in front of a bullet for any of you. And I'll admit to you right now that I'd do it for you guys.
Praise
I'm
God,
being honest. I'm being honest.
praise
Or
God.
I would stand in front of a bullet for my children. But that's just where I'm at right now. But I would, but I would stand in front of y'all first. I really would.
You know, people stand in front of bullets for strangers.
Well, that's true.
They really do. You see instances where
It's just wrong.
Absolutely, man.
where you do it. But before that happened, if you had asked that person, would you stand in front of a bullet for
Right.
somebody over there? They'd probably say no,
No,
but then they did it.
yeah,
You know, I think the question, I don't know, maybe I got the question wrong.
I don't have any biological children,
right.
but I see all of the children that I have interacted with throughout my life as my children. And I would do that. And I would do it for their families. And then I got to thinking, actually, all of humanity is part of my family.
And when I say that, I don't mean just a literal bullet.
Yeah, I know.
When somebody starts talking garbage about this church or one of you, I want to be there to defend. And I guess I got the question wrong. So.
I think that we each, you might say, stand in front of a bullet whenever we have disagreements with people. And are we willing to listen and possibly understand and maybe have to rethink what we thought?
Yes,
That's kind of standing
Absolutely.
in front of a
absolutely.
bullet, you know.
Right
it's-
on.
Mhm.
So a lot of times, all of us are, well, not all of us, I don't want to speak for everyone, but we already have our answers in mind made up.
Yeah,
Like when we go to our Bible, we go to our Bible to confirm that which a lot of times, we go to our Bibles to confirm what we already believe. And that's where we've gotten into a lot of trouble as the church and just as Christians over the years. And we've talked about that before. So, but she does say, and I'll close it out with this, she does say that the hatred will lead to loving. C.S. Lewis said something similar to this, in the same vein. He said, if you find yourself hating an individual, love them anyway.
Mhm.
Make the choice to love them. And pretty soon you'll be surprised. You'll find that you actually do love them. Yes, Jen.
She also brought up, which is what you're bringing up, is that when you love, you have a relationship. When you hate, you have a relationship. The opposite of love is indifference.
You have to be
Mhm.
invested to hate somebody.
Yes.
Go ahead, Crystal.
No, she made a
Oh,
good
right,
point.
okay. Yeah,
That
right.
point, because when I first read that, I'm like, okay, you need to look up what indifference. And that's not caring.
No,
With hate, you must care.
yeah, if you're indifferent towards somebody, you don't hate them. But if
Right.
you're invested, hate is an investment. Yeah,
Right.
yeah, right. That's good. That's very good.
Unfortunately, that's how I dealt with bullying back there in school.
Yeah,
I just became indifferent to the people who were trying to bully me.
yeah.
I don't think you even have to hate somebody. You just don't understand them. You don't,
You don't try to
you don't
understand.
click with them. You know, there are people that you come in contact with who it's just difficult to love them sometimes. And it's,
I'm sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead,
There-
Miss Crystal. Or Carol,
Go
or
ahead,
whoever.
Chris.
It made me take a look at that definition, or how we have always thought the word hate.
Right.
I used to say I never hate anyone, but now I could say it because it gives me an opportunity. It opens the door,
Yeah.
like you said, to love them anyway, because you're gonna find out differently
Yeah,
than the definition of indifference.
right, right, right. Now, there is a holy indifference that our Catholic brothers and sisters talk about. That, and Paul speaks to this. I have learned to be content. Rich, poor, hungry, well-fed.
Right.
And that is a holy indifference that all of us, that Jesus certainly had. This, whatever the situation, I am centered in God. And my life is centered, thy will be done, thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. And that's wonderful. But that is where we're called to, is that holy indifference, to not letting what's happening in our life affect this. That's difficult. But it is something that we can strive to. And so, yeah, that's good.
There have
Yeah, go ahead,
There
Carol.
have
I
been a-
forgot, sorry.
No, that's okay. A couple of this, and this may be totally off track here. But where I had gotten really, really angry at someone a couple of times, but
Me.
one what I found helped me is if I sincerely prayed for that person.
Absolutely.
I found my attitude
Absolutely.
changing for that person.
Yeah.
And one prime example was Bob after Jennifer died. Do you remember that episode that occurred? And I was angry. I was so angry. And I drove down Scenic Highway on the way to Lawrenceville, sincerely praying for him. And it just changed my whole attitude.
Mhm.
And I think that's scriptural because it says you must pray for your enemies.
Go ahead.
I think I shared
Yeah.
with this before, some of you at least, many years ago here at New Hope. We had it was entirely lay people, but it was some morning Bible study kind of thing. And there was a person in that group that I just could never click with. Didn't like her theology, didn't like her attitude. I couldn't think of anything that I really liked about that woman. Well, the person leading the program, who is one of our shut-ins now, one day she came up with this idea. She says, I'm going to pass around this basket with everybody's name in it. If you get your name, put it back and draw somebody else. So we drew the names. I drew that person's name. And the lady doing the thing says, now here's the thing. You pray for that person once today until we meet again next week. Well, I believe in going along with the program. And so I prayed, and my first prayer was, make her a better person. And then, once she becomes a better person, then enrich her life. That kind of stuff. But by the time we came back for the week, she wasn't my bosom buddy.
No.
But she was no longer the person that I really had a negative view about. And it was the prayer that did it.
Oh, yeah.
It was the prayer that did it. I would never have come to that on my own.
I just haven't gotten there with Putin yet.
I haven't prayed for him, so that's why I ain't got that.
I think that's humbling. When you pray for somebody else, you realize that you're not perfect either.
Right.
And, you've got things that other people might be praying for you for. So it's humbling.
Okay. Slave of all. Next week. Session 3. Problematic. That word slave. She is adamant. The early translations of the Bible, translating that word as servant, they missed the force of it. Doulos means slave. Period. End of story. Servant is a making that more palatable. So chapter 3 next week. We'll get into that. Boyd's got one more.
This is
No, please.
after we're not on the subject that we're here today,
go
although
ahead.
somewhat we are. To me, the 14 and 15 of Luke,
Yeah.
all has a similar theme. And that theme is like difficult sayings or things that we really don't see in a literal sense as what's here. Now, and I'm going to give 2 that are not religious, 2 examples here, but they're in 14 where first of all, when it's 28, let's say 28 through 32.
Yeah.
Now, in a lot of places of the world, they don't have mortgages for housing. And they don't have construction loans for houses. My guess is at the time this was written, there weren't mortgage bankers and things in the Middle East. So when I've gone to the Middle East, you go through small areas and you see houses under different stages of construction, and you can look at them and tell that this one has had this much built for a considerable period of time. It was not finished yet.
Right.
This one has been a little longer. So if you talk to those people, what they do is when they've got enough money to do the foundation, they put the foundation.
Mhm.
And then maybe 2 years later, they've got enough to put the walls up. And over there, you don't dry it in the same sense that you dry it in here because they're not built out of wood like they are here. So that really, what is said there has got to have a different meaning than what is literally on the page. Then you come down to here, it says, or what king, when he sets out to meet another king in battle, will not first sit down and consider whether he is strong enough, 10,000 versus the 20,000. Well, you look at Jewish history.
Mhm.
Did any of the Jews, when they went out to battle, consider that, oh, they outnumber us, so we better sue for peace?
I think they did a couple times and then God said, mhm.
But so, and to me, it's the same, it follows on through in the lost sheep.
Sure.
I never was a shepherd because we didn't raise sheep around here, but we did have chickens and other animals and livestock. And if there was something dragging off a chicken, I wouldn't run after that one till I was sure the other ones I had wouldn't be stolen while I was gone.
That's true.
So, and then in the hate your parents thing kind of thing, I think here there's something going on that we're missing. I certainly am missing,
Right.
for sure.
Yeah.
Because the literal, taking it literally.
Right.
And I think the people who heard it, if they took it literally, then they're thinking, what does this mean?
Right.
And I think we have seen passages where he did say some things and people, when he left, people said, well, what did he mean?
Right.
What did he mean?
Yeah.
And he didn't have a loudspeaker to speak over, so the people in the back had a hard enough time hearing anyway.
Probably
glad you
they
brought that up.
heard because people said, what did he say? What did he say? And as it went back, like anything, it gets changed somewhat.
That's what I say to Marie. Marie, we were watching TV and she said, what did he say? I said, well, shut up, will you?
So
And that's why I don't have any hair.
she pulled it all out.
She snatched you ball headed.
Right.
Give Hinton the last comment.
I was gonna say that in Jesus' day, a lot of times entire generations lived together. So to hate one's family, if one left that generation and went out on his own doing stuff, that they consider hating the family.
Yep.
At least that's the way I would look at it.
When you quit following the family tradition.
And they weren't big on their children becoming independent adults.
No,
No, they weren't.
That's the one thing we really got to remember. They were not big on that at all.
We're supposed to go
They-
into the family
The
business.
patriarch was the boss until he died.
Right.
And then the oldest son
Right.
became the boss until he died.
That's right.
And sometimes when they married, the house that was built for the newlywed couple was built onto the family house.
Absolutely.
Right.
Ocean time.
Most probably Joseph's and Mary's dwelling was being built onto Joseph's home. Yeah.
Right.
Most probably. Yeah, that's good. All right, folks, chapter 3 next week, Lord willing. I'm sure I'll be seeing you guys before then. And thank you all so very much. Thank you, Crystal, for joining us, hon. We'll see you next time. Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.